Hello again, friends. Please press pause and go wash your hands very, very well, and then come back and settle. Okay, so we are back with the second part of Chapter 7, First Sight and Second Thoughts. It's quite a long chapter because there's a lot of stuff that happens in here. So we had just heard Tiffany recalling her grandmother telling her the story about the Jolly Sailor tobacco wrapper. And she had just become Kelda of the Feagle clan, which is a very big deal. Someone was tapping politely on her boot. She opened her eyes and saw the toad. It was holding a small rock in its mouth. It spat it out. "Sorry about that," it said. "I'd have used my arms, but we're a very soggy species." "What am I supposed to do?" said Tiffany. "Well, if you hit your head on this low ceiling, you would have definite claim for damages," said the toad. Did I just say that?" "Yes, and I hope you wish you hadn't," said Tiffany. "Why did you say it?" I don't know, moaned the toad. "Sorry, what were we talking about?" "I meant, what do the Pixies want me to do now?" "Oh, I don't think it works like that," said the toad. "You're the Kelda. You say what's to be done." "Why can't Fian be a Kelda? She's a Pixie." "Can't help you there." "Can I be of service?" said a voice by Tiffany's ear. She turned her head and saw on one of the gallery walls that ran around the cave William the Gonigal. Up close he was noticeably different from other Feagles. His hair was neater and braided into one pigtail. He didn't have as many tattoos. He spoke differently, too, more clearly and slowly than the others, sounding his R's like a drum roll. Yes, said Tiffany. "Why can't Fian be Kelda here?" William nodded. "A good question," he said politely. "But ye ken, a Kelda cannot wed her brothers. She must go to a new clan and wed a warrior there." "Well, why couldn't that warrior come here?" "Because the Feagles here would not know him. They'd have no respect for him." William made respect sound like an avalanche. "Oh, well, what was that about the Queen? You were going to say something and they stopped you." William looked embarrassed. "I don't think I can tell you about—" "I am the temporary Kelda," said Tiffany stiffly. "Aye. Well, there was a time when we lived in the Queen's world and served her, before she grew so cold. But she tricked us, and we rebelled. It was a dark time. She does not like us. And that is all I will say," William added. Tiffany watched Feagles going in and out of the Kelda's chamber. Something was going on in there. "They're burying her in another part of the mound," said William without being asked, "with the other Keldas of this clan." "I thought they would be more noisy," said Tiffany. "She was their mother," said William. "They do not want to shout. Their hearts are too full for words. In time we'll hold a wake to help her back to the land of the living, and that'll be a loud one, I can promise you. We'll dance the 512th reel to the tune of the Devil Among the Lawyers, and eat and drink, and I dare say my nephews will have a headache the size of a sheep." The old Feagle smiled briefly. "But for now, each Feagle remembers her in silence. We dinna mourn like you do, you ken. We mourn for them that has to stay behind." "Was she your mother too?" said Tiffany quietly. "Nay, she was my sister. Did she not tell you that when a Kelda goes to a new clan, she takes a few of her brothers with her? To be alone among strangers would be too much for a heart to bear." The Gonigal sighed. "Of course, in time after the Kelda weds, the clan is full of her sons, so it's not so lonely for her." "It must be for you, though," said Tiffany. "You're a quick one, I'll grant that," said William. "I am the last of those who came. When this is o'er, I'll seek the leave of the next Kelda to return to my own folk in the mountains. This is a fine, fat country, and a fine, bonny clan my nephews have, but I would like to die in the heather where I was born. If you would excuse me, Kelda." He walked away and was suddenly lost in the shadows of the mound. Tiffany wanted to go home, Perhaps it was William's sadness, but she now felt shut up in the mound. "I've got to get out of here," she murmured. "Good idea," said the toad. "You've got to find a place where the time is different, for one thing." "But how can I do that?" said Tiffany. "You can't see time." But she stuck her arms through the entrance hole and pulled herself up into the fresh air. There was a big old clock in the farmhouse, and the time on it got set once a week. That is, when her father went to market in Creel Springs, he made a note of the position of the hands on the big clock there, and when he got home, he moved the hands on the clock to the same position. It was really just for show, anyway. Everyone took their time from the sun, and the sun couldn't go wrong. Tiffany now lay among the trunks of the old thorn bushes whose leaves rustled continuously in the breeze. The mound was like a little island in the endless turf. Little primroses and even a few ragged foxgloves grew up here in the shadow of the thorn roots. "She could have just told me where to look," she said. "But she didn't know where it would be," said the toad. "She just knew the signs to look for." Tiffany rolled over carefully and stared up at the sky between the low branches. "It'll shine out," the Kelda had said. "I think you ought to talk to Hamish." I think I ought to talk to Hamish," she said. "Right you are, Mistress," said a voice by her ear. She turned her head. "How long have you been there?" "All the time, Mistress," said the pixie. Others poked their heads around the trees and out from under the leaves. There were at least 20 on the mound. "You've been watching me all the time." "Aye, Mistress. It's our task to watch over our Kelda. I'm up here most of the time anyway because I'm studying to become a Gonagle." The young Feegle flourished a set of mouse pipes. "And they will not let me play down there on account of them saying my playing sounds like a spider trying to fart through its ears, Mistress." "But what happens if I want to what happens if I don't want you to guard me?" "If it's a wee collinator you're talking about, Mistress, the cludgy is over there in the chalk pit. You'll just sing out to us where you're going and no one will go peeking. You'll have our word on it," said the attendant Feegle. Tiffany glared at him as he stood in the primroses, beaming with pride and anxious duty. He was one of the younger of them, without as many scars and lumps. Even his nose wasn't broken. "What's your name, Pixie?" she said. "Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock, Mistress. There's not many Feegle names you ken, so we have to share." "Well, not as big as Little Jock," Tiffany began. "That'd be medium-sized Jock, Mistress," said Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock. "Well, not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock, I can—" "That's not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock, Mistress," said Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock. "You're one Jock short," he added helpfully. "Wouldn't you be happier with a name like Henry?" said Tiffany, helpless. "Ach, no, Mistress." Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock wrinkled his face. "There's no history to the name, you ken. But there have been a number of brave warriors called Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock. Why, 'tis as nearly famous a name as Wee Jock itself. And of course, should Wee Jock itself be taken back to the last world, then I'll get the name of Wee Jock. Which isn't to say that I mislike the name of Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock, you ken. There's been many a fine story of the exploits of Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock, the pixie added, looking so earnest that Tiffany didn't have the heart to say that they must have been very long stories. Instead, she said, "Well, I want to talk to Hamish, the aviator." "No problem," said Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock. "He's up there right now." He vanished. A moment later, Tiffany heard, or rather felt with her ears, the bubbling sensation of a Feegle whistle. Ooh, get thirsty after all those names. Tiffany pulled Diseases of the Sheep, which was now looking very battered, out of her apron. There was a blank page in the back. She tore it out, feeling like a criminal for doing so, and took out her pencil. "Dear Mum and Dad," she wrote carefully. "How are you? I am well. Wentworth is also well, but I have to go and fetch him from where he's staying. I hope to be back soon. Tiffany. P.S. I hope the cheese is all right. She crossed out where she was about to say the Queen. She was just considering this when she heard a rush of wings overhead. There was a whirring noise and a moment of silence, and then a small, rather muffled and weary voice said, "Oh, cravens." She looked out onto the turf. The body of Hamish was upside down a few feet away. His arms with their twirlers were still outstretched. No words could describe what a Feegle in a Celt looks like upside down, so we won't try. It took some time to get him out. If he had landed head first in spinning, Tiffany was told, he had to be unscrewed in the opposite direction so that his ears wouldn't come off. When he was upright and swaying unsteadily, Tiffany said, "Can you wrap this letter in a stone and drop it in front of the farmhouse where people will see it? Aye, Mistress." "And does it hurt when you land head first like that?" "Nay, Mistress, but it's awful embarrassing." "Then there's a sort of toy we used to make that might help you. You make kind of a bag of air." "Bag of air," said the aviator, looking puzzled. "Well, you know how things like shirts billow out on a clothesline when it's windy? Well, you just make a cloth bag and tie some strings to it and a stone to the strings, and when you throw it up, the bag fills with air and the stone floats down." Hamish stared at her. "Do you understand me?" said Tiffany. "Oh, I was just waiting to see if you were going to tell me anything else," said Hamish politely. "Do you think you could, borrow some fine cloth?" "Nay, Mistress, but I can steal some," said Hamish. Tiffany decided not to comment on this. She said, "Where was the Queen when the mist came down?" Hamish pointed. "About half a mile yonder, Mistress." In the distance, Tiffany could see some more mounds and a few stones from the old days. Trilithons, they were called, which just meant 3 stones. The only stones found naturally on the downs were flints, but the giant stones of the Trilithons had been dragged from at least 10 miles away, and they were stacked like a child stacks toy bricks. Here and there big stones had been stood in circles. Sometimes one stone had been placed all alone. It must have taken a lot of people a long time to do all of that. Some people said there had been human sacrifices up here. Some said they were part of some old religion. Some said they marked ancient graves. Some said they were a warning. Avoid this place. Tiffany hadn't. She'd been there with her sisters a few times as a dare, just in case there were any skulls. But the mounds around the stones were thousands of years old. All that you found now were rabbit holes. "Anything else, Mistress?" said Hamish politely. "Nay? Then I'll just be going." He raised his arms over his head and started to run across the turf. Tiffany jumped as the Buzzard skimmed down a few feet away from her and snatched him back up into the sky. "How can a man 6 inches high train a bird like that?" she asked as the Buzzard circled again for height. "Oh, all it takes is a wee drop of kindness, Mistress," said Not As Big as Medium-Sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock. "Really?" "Aye, and a big dollop of cruelty." Not as big as Medium-Sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock said. "Hamish trains him by running around in a rabbit skin until the bird pounces on him." "That sounds awful," said Tiffany. "Oh, he's not too nasty about it. He just knocks them out with his head, and then he's got a special oil that he makes that he blows up their beak." Not As Big as Medium-Sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock went on. "When they wakes up, they think he's their mammy, and they'll do his bidding." The Buzzard was already a distant speck. "He hardly seems to spend any time on the ground," said Tiffany. "Oh, aye. He sleeps in the Buzzard's nest at night. He says it's wonderfully warm, and he spends all his time in the air." Not as big as Medium-Sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock added. "He's never happy unless he's got the wind under his kilt." "And the birds don't mind?" "Och, no, Mistress. All the birds and beasts up here know it's good luck to be friends with a Feegle." "They do?" "Well, to tell you the truth, Mistress, it's more that they know it's unlucky not to be friends with a Feegle." Tiffany looked at the sun. It was only a few hours from setting. "I must find a way in," she said. "Look, not as big as Medium-Sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock, Mistress," said the Pixie patiently. "Yes, thank you. Where is Rob anybody? Where is everybody, in fact?" The young Pixie looked a bit embarrassed. There's a bit of debate going on below, Mistress, he said. Well, I have to find my brother, okay? I am the Kelda in this vicinity. It's a wee bit more complicated than that, Mistress. They're discussing you... Discussing what about me? Not as big as medium-sized Jock, but bigger than Wee Jock. Jock looked as if he really didn't want to be standing there. They're discussing... Tiffany gave up. The pixie was blushing. Since he was blue to begin with, this turned him an unpleasant violet color. I'll go back down the hole. Give my boots a push, will you? She slid down the dry dirt. The Feagles scattered in the cave below as she landed. When her eyes got accustomed to the gloom once more, she saw the galleries were crowded with pixies again. Some of them were in the middle of washing, and many of them had, for some reason, smoothed down their red hair with grease. They all stared at her as if caught in the middle of something dreadful. We ought to be going if we're going to follow the queen, she said, looking down at Rob Anybody, who'd been washing his face in a basin made of half a walnut shell. Water dripped off his beard, which he'd braided up. There were 3 braids in his long hair, too. If he turned suddenly, he'd probably whip somebody to death. Ah, well, he said, there's a wee matter we've got to sort out first, Kelda. He twiddled the tiny washcloth in his hands. When Rob Anybody twiddled, he was worried. Yes, said Tiffany. Will you no have a cup of tea? Said Rob Anybody, and a pixie staggered forward with a big gold cup that must have been made for a king. Tiffany took it. She was thirsty, after all. There was a sigh from the crowd when she sipped the tea. It was actually quite good. We stole it from a peddler who was asleep down by the high road, said Rob Anybody. Good stuff, eh? He patted down his hair with his wet hands. Tiffany's cup stopped halfway to her lips. Perhaps the pixies didn't realize how loudly they whispered because her ear was on level with their conversation. She's a bit on the big side, no offense to her. Aye, but a Kelda has to be big, you ken, to have lots of wee babies. Aye, fair enough, a big woman is very well, but if a laddie were to cuddle with this one, he'd have to leave a chalk mark to show where he left off yesterday. And she's a bit young. She'd needna have any babies yet, or maybe not too many at a time. No more than 10, maybe. Crivens, lads, what are you talking about? 'Tis Rob Anybody who'll shoes anyway. You can see the big man's poor wee knees knocking from here. Tiffany lived on a farm. Any little belief about babies are delivered by storks or found under bushes tend to get sorted out early on if you live on a farm, especially when a cow is having difficult calving in the middle of the night. And she'd help with the lambing when small hands could be very useful in difficult cases. She knew all about bags of red chalk on the rams had strapped to their chests. You knew why later on the ewes had the red smudges on their backs were going to be mothers in the spring. It's amazing what a child who is quiet and observant can learn, and this includes things people don't think she's old enough to learn. Her eye spotted Fionn on the other side of the hall. She was smiling in a worrying way. What's happening, Rob Anybody? She said, laying the words down carefully. Well, it's the clan rules, you ken, said the Feagle awkwardly. You be in the new Kelda, and we're bound to ask you, see, no matter what we feel, we got to ask you for... He stepped back quickly. I didn't quite catch that, said Tiffany. We've scrubbed up nice, you ken, Rob Anybody said. Some of the lads actually had a bath in the dew pond, even though it's only May, and Big Jan washed under his arms for the first time ever, and Daft Willie has picked you a bonny bunch of flowers. Daft Willie stepped forward, swollen with nervous pride, and thrust the aforesaid bouquet into the air. They probably had once been nice flowers, but he didn't have much of an idea of what a bunch was and how you picked one. Stems and leaves and dropping petals stuck out of his fist in all directions. Very nice, said Tiffany, taking another sip of the tea. Good, said Rob Anybody, wiping his forehead. So maybe you'd like to tell us what... They want to know which one of them you're going to marry, said Fionn loudly. It's the rules. You have to choose or quit as Kelda. You have to choose your man and name the day. Aye, said Rob Anybody, not meeting Tiffany's eyes. Tiffany held the cup perfectly steady, but only because she suddenly couldn't move a muscle. She was thinking, "Oh, this is not happening to me. I can't. He couldn't. We wouldn't. They're not even. This is ridiculous. Run away." But she was aware of hundreds of nervous faces in the shadows. How you deal with this is going to be important, said her second thoughts. They're all watching you, and Fionn wants to see what you'll do. You really oughtn't to dislike a girl 4 feet shorter than you, but you do. "Well, this is very unexpected," she said, forcing herself to smile. "And a big honor, of course." Aye, said Rob Anybody, looking at the floor. "And there's so many of you, it'd be hard to choose," Tiffany went on, still smiling. And her second thoughts said, "He's not happy about that either." "Aye, it will that," said Rob Anybody. "I'd just like to have a little fresh air while I think about it," said Tiffany, and didn't let the smile fade until she was out on the mound again. She crouched down and peered among the primrose leaves. "Toad!" she yelled. The toad crawled out, chewing something. It said, "They want to marry me." "What are you eating?" "A very undernourished slug," it said. "I said they want to marry me." And? Well, just think." "Oh, right, yeah, the height thing," said the toad. "It might not seem like much now, but when you're 5 feet 7, he'll still be 6 inches high." "Don't laugh at me, I'm the Kelda." "Well, of course, that's the point, isn't it?" said the toad. "As far as they're concerned, there are rules. The new Kelda marries the warrior of her choice and settles down and has lots and lots of feagles. It'd be a terrible insult to refuse." "I am not going to marry a feagle. I can't have hundreds of babies. Tell me what to do." "Me? Tell the Kelda what to do? I wouldn't dare," said the toad. "And I don't like being shouted at. Even toads have their pride, you know." He crawled back into the leaves. Tiffany took a deep breath, ready to shout, and then closed her mouth. The old Kelda must have known about this, she thought. So, she must have thought I'd be able to deal with it. It's just the rules, and they didn't know what to do about them. None of them wanted to marry a big girl like her, even if none of them would admit it. It was just the rules. There must be some way around it. There had to be. Accept a husband, and she had to name the day. They'd told her that. She stared at the thorn trees for a moment. She thought. She slid back down the hole. The pixies were waiting nervously, every scarred and beaded face watching hers. "I accept you, Rob Anybody," she said. Rob Anybody's face became a mask of terror, and she heard him mutter, "Oh, cravings," in a tiny voice. "But, of course, it's the bride who names the day, isn't it?" said Tiffany cheerfully. "Everyone knows that." "Aye," Rob Anybody quavered. "That's the tradition, right enough." "Then I shall." Tiffany took a deep breath. "At the end of the world is a great big mountain of granite rock 1 mile high," she said. "And every year a tiny bird flies all the way to the rock and wipes its beak on it. Well, when the little bird has worn the mountain down to the size of a grain of sand, that's the day I'll marry you, Rob Anybody Feagle." Rob Anybody's terror turned to outright panic. Then he hesitated and very slowly started to grin. "Aye, good idea," he said slowly. "It does not do to rush these things." "Absolutely," said Tiffany. "And that give us time to sort out the guest list and that," the pixie went on. "That's right. Plus, there's all that business with the wedding dress and buckets of flowers and that kind of thing," said Rob Anybody, looking more cheerful by the second. "That sort of thing can take forever, you can." "Oh, yes," said Tiffany. "But she's really just told you no," Fionn burst out. "It'd take millions of years for a bird to—" "She said aye," Rob Anybody shouted. "You heard her, lads. And she's named the day. That's the rules." "No problem about the mountain either," said Daft Willie, holding out the flowers. "Just tell us where it is, and I reckon we can have it down a lot faster than any wee birdie." "It's got to be the bird," yelled Rob Anybody desperately. "Okay, the wee birdie. No more arguing. Anyone feeling like arguing will feel my boot. Some of us have got a wee laddie to steal back from the Queen." He drew his sword and waved it in the air. "Who's coming with me?" That seemed to work. The Nakmekfeagle liked clear goals. Hundreds of swords and battle axes and one bunch of battered flowers in the case of Daft Willie were thrust into the air, and the war cry of the Nakmekfeagle echoed around the chamber. The period of time it takes a pixie to go from normal to mad fighting mood is so tiny it can't be measured by the tiniest clock. Unfortunately, since the pixies were each very individualistic, each one had his own cry, and Tiffany could only make out a few over the din. They can take our lives, but they cannot take our trousers. You'll take the high road, and I'll take your wallet. There can only be 1,000. Ah, stick up your trackings. But the voices gradually came together in one roar that shook the walls. Nay, king, nay, queen, nay, lord, nay, master, we will not be fooled again. I'm trying to see if we should keep going. I'm going to stop here. I'm going to finish the rest of the chapter next time. I hope you've enjoyed it so far. The story's getting really good. I love this book so much. I hope you like it too. Remember, you can email me if you have any questions, Lindsay, Mistretta at postoakschool.org, and I will see you next time.